The torsion field theory of Shipov and Akimov, author Sergei Gribov. The topic of torsion fields was popular in the early 2010s, but by now discussions about it have died down and most materials have been removed from the internet. French scientist Élie Joseph Cartan introduced the term torsion fields in the early 20th century. These are just twisting fields. It was purely theoretical, but practical results only appeared at the end of the 20th century. Various devices were designed, and everyone had their own explanations of the theory since it was raw and didn't fit into fundamental science. Physicist Oleg Gritskevič proposed combining water rotation with a magnetic field in the 1980s. Using a 1932 patent by French physicist Rancke, he built a device where water rotated inside a tube and heated up from its own rotation. He called the device a hydromagnetic dynamo. Externally, it resembled a 5-meter wide bagel. Inside this apparatus, water circulated, which was heated to a high temperature. The experimental installation was assembled in Armenia, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and supplied electricity to a scientific town. The generated power for several years was about 2 megawatts. After the war, the device was dismantled and the invention forgotten. Gritskevič took the whole developer team to the United States at the Americans' invitation. There they completed and built a more powerful model of the hydromagnetic dynamo. However, its mass production was also prohibited there. Otherwise, the oil-based world order would have come to an end. Oleg Gritskevič explains the miracle that defies the law of energy conservation. A water molecule has a spatial structure in the shape of the pyramid of Cheops. 1 cubic centimeter of water contains 1,000,000 molecules. At a pressure of 10 atmospheres in the pipe, the vortices twisting the water break the molecular pyramids. The hydrogen and oxygen atoms separate, but when they come back together into molecules, a lot of energy is released. So the new energy theorists Anatoly Akimov and Gennady Shipov claimed that the energy of spun water, which allows the efficiency to exceed 100%, is extracted from the physical vacuum. They discovered an interesting property of the torsion field when it was generated by a shape, for example, a pyramid. In other words, architectural shapes become a kind of loophole for energies still unknown to science to penetrate into physical space. The mutual influence of different shapes turns out to be especially interesting. As it turns out, any geometric figure disrupts and polarizes the strict order of the ether, and a torsion field immediately forms next to it. Further research led the authors to even more radical discoveries meant to replace fundamental science and guaranteed to change world history. As often happens during times of social upheaval, control over technology by global authorities weakens and inventors begin to release perpetual motion machines and other forbidden devices. The same thing happened with torsion fields. At the end of the 1990s, the team led by Shipov-Akimov received support from the government and the armed forces. And in a short time, a lot of technologies and devices were invented based on new principles that didn't fit not only within the framework of official science, but even within the framework of official religion. These discoveries were meant to undermine the existing worldview as well. In the early 2000s, Ran awoke and resumed the purpose she was created for over 250 years ago. The Commission on Pseudoscience labeled the theory of torsion fields as pseudoscientific and soon ended all funding and use of these technologies. Valerie. From personal experience, in 2009 we corresponded with Akimov and he gave many explanations that are not found in any sources. First, for a week he suspected I was one of the RAN trolls who had terrorized him so much he stopped leaving his house. When I explained that I was researching the influence of astral parasites on humans and showed him the website, he became interested and started communicating. Apparently, he read the website about Lyarvi, because later he teased me using my own terms. It turned out he was a psychic himself and could actually see these energy entities as well as torsion fields, and not only see them but also manipulate them. And that's exactly why he was able to make such progress in development. I asked him to explain to me how to make the simplest torsion generator. It turned out to be simple. You just need to spin 4 neodymium magnets by placing them, for example, on the blades of a fan. The faster the rotation, the more intense the extraction of the torsion field from the vacuum. It turns out that with such gentle extraction, it flows downward and spreads to the sides, passing through wood, metal, and other materials. But there are also materials, object structures, and specially created fields that can retain or reflect the torsion field. That means you can actually manipulate it as an object. According to him, energetic entities panic when they enter the area where the torsion field is generated, and he described several vivid examples of patients recovering when the device was used in their apartment. The parasitic entity that was driving a person to death would leave the patient, and the patient would recover, either physically or in other cases mentally. Unfortunately, I was unable to see torsion fields, even though he gave me some instructions on how to learn to do this in a short time. I tested these torsion generators for a while, and I got clear effects on the level of sensations. There was always a metallic taste in my mouth and other sensations. But, as Anatoly Yevgenyevich warned, if a person is not a psychic, he won't be able to structure the generated field, and it will break through his aura, his energy field, and the person will get sick. I often found that after each test, my energy field was disrupted and I developed respiratory illnesses. And when my 2-year-old child started catching colds after such tests, I stopped these experiments. Anatoly Yevgenyevich reminded me of a higher mathematics professor in my first year. When a slow student started to struggle, he would start yelling, and somehow this would structure your perception and consciousness, making things clearer. Similarly, Anatoly Yevgenyevich would yell at me, even in letters, when I was slow or didn't understand how to attach magnets to the fan, and my mind would clear up. Honestly, I think someone was lucky to work and explore the unknown with this amazing person. Maybe psychics don't see the torsion fields directly, but instead sense how the environment reacts and refer to this as the subtle planes. There are many such disturbances in nature, including the human aura. A person's consciousness interprets multidimensional sensations into images based on their life experience, fears, and beliefs. People usually see things based on their abilities, and perception is not consistently repeatable. Scientific requirements. It all depends on how things go, on one's condition and mood. The generally accepted idea of the torsion field is different from how Akimov explained it in Personal Messages. If it is officially declared not as matter, but as information about matter, then how can it behave like a liquid? The creator of ether dynamics, Atsukovsky Vladimir Akimovich, based on data from numerous scientific experiments conducted since the beginning of the 20th century, came to the same conclusion that ether can and should be described using the universal formulas of thermodynamics. And in fact, ether can flow through matter and have a high speed of movement. From this, it flows around the Earth, slowing down near the surface, and also enters the Earth's interior in large streams. And other researchers of ether are convinced that substances, including water, are actually materialized in the depths of the Earth from that primary matter into all useful minerals. Hydrogen is present in large amounts within rock layers, where bacteria use it to produce oil and gas. And when it comes out from the depths in certain places, ether first materializes into hydrogen, which in turn creates clouds at all levels, that is, into water. And those who once called hydrogen vodorod in Russian knew very well who gives birth to what and how the true laws of nature work. It turns out that ether and torsion fields may be the same thing, or a component or effects of a single primary matter from which the matter of the three-dimensional world can both be born and controlled. If you know how. I have a feeling that at this point you can start to realize that magic is not at all what people have been led to believe over the past centuries. Then the experimenters found that if the torsion field is extracted rigidly by electronic means, it is ejected at high initial speed in different directions and, as verified, causes harm to the human energy body, up to and including fatal outcomes. You can imagine such a torsion grenade or bomb and look for its analogues, for example, in the Mahabharata. That's why a generator with a cone-shaped nozzle in the form of a pistol was invented, which the operator directed toward the target. At the same time, the operator modulates the outgoing flow with his thought, forming an image and the laws by which our material world functions, making them susceptible to change. This is what we call magical influence, but we can't imagine how it can be done, let alone repeated. Akimov clearly hinted that they had actually reached the level of Techno-Magic, and the result of such magical influence could be anything, up to and including the materialization of objects. But the depth and strength of the influence on materiality directly depends on the level of training of the operator psychic, and by his own admission, he himself was a rather strong operator. He gave an example of influencing materiality so that it would be clear what it actually is. During experiments related to finding oil deposits using torsion fields, their group ended up at an oil site in 50-degree frost. At that temperature, diesel fuel becomes viscous, and when the workers opened the tap, they couldn't pour it into the bucket. They had a portable generator, and the researchers decided to use it to alter the fluid's viscosity. The operator turned on the device, pointed it at the barrel, and stood there, mentally picturing the diesel fuel as liquid. After 10 minutes, the workers opened the valve, and the diesel fuel flowed into the bucket with normal pressure, as if it were flowing at -10 degrees Celsius. Akimov clarified that the barrel contained several tons of diesel fuel. Now think about what you can do with such a generator. I thought about it once, then twice, and then imagined that the generator could be made extremely powerful, and I wasn't completely impressed, only because my doubts saved me. Maybe Akimov is crazy. Why would he tell such things to strangers? Or maybe they're just trying to get government funding this way. Now I'm sure that all these technologies are not only possible, but they're just a small part of what was used in pre-flood civilizations. And there are plenty of facts about Techno-Magic. Watch Viktor Maximenkov's channel. Who knows, maybe they're passing off medieval torsion emitters as muskets and strange pistols with wide barrels. Then researchers discovered that torsion fields are recorded on photo paper during photo printing. They're instantly recorded in multiple dimensions. That's why a method was proposed to find mineral resources using photographs of the area taken from a high-flying airplane. And there's nothing surprising about it, says Akimov, because the same technology is used by searchers using photographs or dowsers, using themselves as a detector of torsion fields. Moreover, a person is built in such a way that he is an ideal generator of torsion fields. The chest is a resonator, breathing is the pump, and the brain is the structurer. Plus, all the internal organs and limbs are additional devices for tuning and ensuring the functioning of the torsion device called a human. And if you learn to use your body correctly, you won't need any additional technical devices. A human is alone a perfect torsion generator and detector. Think about it. Why does global governance put so much effort into destabilizing the human body and confusing the mind? It's so that a person doesn't become what he truly is. The technology for such a search has grown into an entire scientific field. I won't retell the stories taken from his lectures about how they shocked oil workers by finding oil deposits unknown to geological exploration. And then all of this was confirmed, how they found mineral resources indicating not only the location but also the depth at which they were buried. Considering that for decades after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, no development was carried out at all due to the total plundering of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' legacy, and the explored deposits were depleted very quickly. What kind of breakthrough should have happened after the introduction of such technologies? But no, the Commission on Pseudoscience managed to stop funding for research, and this technology was rejected and most likely ended up in the West. By the way, Akimov was aware that oil reservoirs that had been completely depleted would refill again after several decades. And he successfully demonstrated this using his spin resonance scanning, which caused quite a stir in the oil industry. The newly minted oligarchs rushed to buy up depleted oil fields. When we talk about torsion fields, we're dealing with a completely new kind of physics. It's an open-ended science where there is interaction with unexplored fields and their properties. Shipov claims that here we are studying interactions with the physical vacuum. Surprisingly, the torsion field has highly unusual properties. Although discovered and studied by scientists worldwide for a long time, only Shipov and Akimov truly attempted to describe the overall picture of this field. Here are some of the properties that clearly fall outside the framework of existing concepts in modern science. First, the speed of propagation of the torsion field in physical vacuum can greatly exceed the speed of light. In fact, the transmission of a signal in this field is instantaneous. In other words, the concept of time as we understand it in the material world does not apply there. This means that the limiting condition of the speed of light being insurmountable does not exist for these fields. How this fits with the description of a liquid torsion field with the properties of some kind of fluid is still unclear to me. Second, the torsion field is directly connected to what is called the physical vacuum. And since matter itself exists in the physical vacuum, essentially, it unites material objects with each other. Therefore, it becomes the medium from which a new type of energy is drawn, or a medium in which there are no limitations on the speed of information transfer, since this medium has different properties. Third, the torsion field has properties of informational influence. The physical vacuum affects the torsion field and vice versa, like holograms affecting each other. This is a completely new property that is not characteristic of the concepts of modern science, and such an informational property has been proven by researchers many times. In fact, first comes the informational structure and then its material component. Therefore, by changing the torsion component, it is possible to physically influence or alter matter. Scientists understand that the physical vacuum is not the ether. The torsion field forms in the physical vacuum, which remains largely unstudied. Recent experiments on the orbital station surprised everyone when plasma in a vacuum and zero gravity unexpectedly showed crystal lattice properties. In other words, the cosmonauts confirmed what Akimov was talking about. The vacuum is a hologram, which we have not studied at all. Obviously, these facts do not fit into the existing frameworks of modern physics, but researchers have created devices and technological processes based on the knowledge of this principle. In addition, there are many additional facts that are only invisible to the blind. Akimov says the following in one of his interviews. In order to understand how the torsion signal spreads, we turn to the most influential and well-funded organizations at the time, the Ministry of Defense and the KGB. On the military side, technical specialists from the main Directorate of Space Assets participated in the experiment. On the KGB side, the most talented engineers from the Government Communications Directorate took part. With their help, we found a technical solution. After all, torsion wave transmitters are completely different from the radio wave transmitters we know, and torsion signal receivers have nothing in common with radio receivers. Highly skilled engineers from the two largest organizations helped in the creation of the torsion equipment. In 1986, information was transmitted by Torsion method for the first time in Moscow. This method allows everything previously sent by radio waves, sound and images to be transmitted. It was found that the speed of a torsion signal is billions of times faster than the speed of light. For comparison, a radio signal reaches the moon in 10 minutes, while a torsion signal does so instantly. Here's another quote from Akimov. The torsion transmitter was installed on the first floor of the building and did not have any devices, like a radio antenna, that could be placed on the roof. The torsion receiver was located on the second floor of a building at a distance of about 22 kilometers. Under these conditions, the torsion signal could only propagate directly from the transmitter to the receiver. This meant that, in addition to the terrain, given the building density in the city of Moscow, the torsion signal had to pass through a barrier equivalent to a reinforced concrete wall more than 50 meters thick. For radio communication without a repeater, this is practically an unsolvable task. Such communication can, for example, replace complex infrasound deep water communication. How the signals will be separated from each other, just like radio waves are separated now, these questions have also been solved. Therefore, ideally, inefficient radio communication can be abandoned altogether. And if we are to search space for intelligent civilizations, then no intelligent beings would use useless and harmful radio communication in interstellar space. The authors of the theory established that, since groups of homogeneous objects carry a certain torsion imprint or a kind of signature, they conducted a series of studies in which, using a photograph, they could detect the shadow left by an object that had previously been there. Here's what Akimov writes about this. In 7th grade, students perform a similar magnet experiment. They sprinkle metal shavings on a sheet of paper, bring a magnet underneath, and the shavings align along the magnetic field lines. We remove the magnet, but the shavings continue to display its field. Something similar happens with the torsion field, except it arranges not shavings, but the properties of the space in which it exists. In other words, if you sat on a bench in the park, an imprint of you as a being with all your multidimensional properties remains on the bench even after you leave. However, there are too many such imprints in public places. They mix together, and maybe it is in this energetic way that we pick up distortions from other people's imprints onto our own bodies, and then we end up feeling drained. Any psychic operator will confirm that if you take a clean imprint of a person, you can later influence them at any distance. And here we once again reach the level of Techno-Magic, where there is no place for any mysticism or religion. Thus, the humanoid celestial beings described in numerous ancient myths were most likely just technomages. Even in cases when they didn't use any technical devices, this makes all religions cargo cults. Another area of work was the influence on the casting of metal alloys when irradiated with a torsion generator. Here's what Akimov writes about this. You see a gray box on my desk about the size of a television. This is a torsion field generator. You don't have to take my word for it. Who knows what might be inside the box? Now I turn on the generator and bring it to the smelting furnace. The plasticity of the produced silumin, an alloy of aluminum and silicon, doubles while its strength also increases. For those who understand, this feeling surpasses an efficiency of 300%. Normally, a 3% increase in a metal's plasticity is a success, but doubling it is unprecedented. There's no doubt that the grey box influenced the result. After all, I'm not a magician. The Central Research Institute of Materials in St. Petersburg achieved the same result using my method, but I was not involved. Moreover, the effect does not depend on the distance between the generator and the melting furnace or on shielding. If an electromagnetic field were involved, the shield would cancel out its influence. We know all physical fields weaken with the square of the distance from the object. So, the gray box generates a field with previously unknown properties. By stating that it's a torsion field, I'm not making a discovery. Such fields were described in 1922 by the French mathematician Élie Cartan. And as we already know, the torsion field. Such a generator can also be modulated either by the properties of the sample, for example, the desired metal or even another material, or by the influence of a psychic operator. And then the invention of a metal with new properties can already be called an art, since the number of possible outcomes starts to approach infinity. It should also be said that most likely it was Akimov who was the driving force pushing this idea forward, despite conventions and limitations. Shapov, on the other hand, was the person who tried to fit the new science into the framework of the generally accepted one, to tidy it up, to round it off to commonly used concepts and postulates. Which, of course, turned out to be impossible to do, since this kind of knowledge was meant to leave nothing standing of the fundamental science based on the postulates of Einstein and other scientists who shaped its image. Perhaps in this way he was trying to legitimize the theory of torsion fields in order to make it officially recognized. From the experience of Sergei Gribov, at the dawn of perestroika, I myself encountered what is now called torsion fields. We were developing new methods for working with internal combustion engines. Without going into lengthy details, just imagine that you take a stone, grind it into dust, and add what you get to oil or fuel. The internal combustion engine performs better after a brief operation. You may have heard of something called tribotechnical additives for oils and lubricants. We collected stones from places like the dumps of a mine in Podmurmansk and from the Inguri River in Abkhazia. We crushed them, performed spectral analysis of the powders, and tested them on our own cars, because nobody else would give us their cars for experiments. The results surpassed our expectations, but something else matters more. We ourselves couldn't find a clear explanation for what was happening. Attempts were made to justify the phenomenon, otherwise continuing the research scientifically would have been difficult. Our setup for crushing this kind of ore chunks was centrifugal. The rotation speed was as high as possible for the engines of that time. Basically, the stones were ground into powder between the chamber walls and the cams, generating high temperatures. So we have all the signs here that those very rotation fields were present in the experiments. For fun, we began influencing the chamber with our palms while the grinding was happening. We tried to mentally assign different properties to the powder. As a result, we got powders not only with different properties, but they even started to differ from each other in their spectral composition. Ultimately, this was not a discovery of new prospects for us, but a tragedy, because no one at any scientific level even wanted to hear about the possibility of this kind of influence on materials and put a stop to any developments in this direction. We tried to approach scientific centers, looked for funding, but it was all useless. At that time, we had negotiations with an Italian corporation that was interested in our developments. But unlike Hrytskiewicz's group, no one agreed to move to Italy to continue the research we had started. Where the technology was born, it ended up being buried. In the hierarchy of state administration and in scientific structures, there are clearly defined rules preventing new technologies from entering mass production. All permitted technologies are strictly sorted, checked for consistency with official fundamental science and for logistics. Only then, carefully measured and following a complex plan, are they added to production. The only place where you can show initiative is in the engineering field, within the framework of permitted technologies. Instructions for the Russian Academy of Sciences can be found in books from 250 years ago. As expected, achievements in the study of torsion fields were classified as secret. And that's why we'll only have to guess where and how this might be used, and is already being used. How can an ordinary person imagine something without a name in that conceptual framework? The methodical classification of discoveries and the systematic persecution and neglect of scientists seeking new scientific foundations through global governance are thoroughly executed. There is no doubt that the masters of the earth have all these technologies and they use them to the fullest extent. But each such discovery by people has the potential to bring humanity to a new stage of development, after which global governance would become much more complicated. And today, the so-called global predictor sees the solution in chipping and digitizing all people to ensure 100% control. Only then can these technologies be introduced without risking loss of control over the surface colony.